Member meeting. I'm really glad that y'all are here. Let's jump to the next slide, Gisa. My name is Scott Simpson. I am usually with the DHS Procurement Innovation Lab, but I'm kind of on a secondement to GSA's Revolutionary Fire Overhaul. I'm the government chair, along with Mike Scorney from GSA. And today we've also got Gisa Sateri with us. She's our industry chair, and Ben Marglin, our industry vice chair. And we have a very new programs chair, Nicole Nunn, and so we are really happy to have her with us as well. If you don't know, if this is your first time visiting us with the Acquisition COI, welcome, and we hope that you come back. We kind of think of ourselves as the center of the universe because really acquisition does help make everything run. Whether you're talking about IT or human resources or just whatever else, there's just so much of it that needs an acquisition to get that off the ground. And so we kind of touch on a lot of different things, and we try to stay relevant. And our big topic this summer, if you haven't heard, there's this FAR overhaul going on. And so we're talking about that a lot this summer. Let's go on to the next slide because we have more events coming up this summer. For us, the summer doesn't end until September 23rd. And so you can join us next month as well. We're going to have a fireside chat with Shani Hashmi. He's a former commissioner of the Federal Acquisition Service at GSA. And I really hope that you'll come back for that with the Acquisition COI. I'm going to toss it over to Gisa now because this is actually her time.
Awesome. Thank you, Scott. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for joining us. And my name is Gisa Sateri with SAIC, and I'm the COI Industry Chair. In addition to the COI offering this session, we're doing this in collaboration with the GSA Federal Inside Exchange team, which I'm proudly a member of as well. The FIE serves as a platform that brings industry and government executives together for focused discussions that are related to priorities, challenges, success stories that are relevant to that agency. And we have about 15 teams in the FIE program series, always looking for new volunteers. If you're interested in volunteering for the GSA team or any of the other agency teams, please don't hesitate to contact April Davis. If you don't have her email address, which I'm assuming everyone does, is adavis@actiac.org. So with that, we have a packed agenda. So we want to get started with introducing our guest speaker today, Alan Thomas. For those of you that may not be familiar with Alan, I think it's ironic, Alan, you would think that your name would be common, but somehow, some way, I don't know any other Alan Thomases.
I'll take that. I'll take that.
Yeah, exactly. So he is currently working with senior leaders to create and execute growth strategies. He was the first politically appointed commissioner for the GSA Federal Acquisition Services. Before that, it was a career role, and an original board member of the Technology Modernization Fund. Before and after joining the federal government, Alan has served as a C-level executive for technology and professional services firms, primarily working in the federal space. And before we dig into our laundry list of questions for Alan around acquisition reform, I want to turn it over to him for a quick intro. Alan?
Oh, yeah, thanks. Thanks, Gisa. Yeah, look, really happy to be here today. Always appreciate invites like this. Really looking forward to questions and dialogue. I see a number of familiar names in the participant list, so it should be great. In terms of context, when I think about all the things that are going on right now in the federal acquisition system, I do think it sometimes sort of helps to step back and look at the past. And maybe this is because I was a history major in college, right? But I do think the past can kind of help inform the present. And the system does periodically go through, bouts of change like this, shall we say, right? And I think this is a fairly significant change, but it's not without precedent, right? There are a number of activities, maybe if you're kind of new to the space or haven't been in it that long, you might feel like, oh my gosh, this is crazy, this is overwhelming. It's like, hey, the last time something like this happened was really in the mid-1990s, right? When there was if you remember, a government-wide initiative to reinvent the government. It was actually led by the vice president at the time. He went around handing out hammers for people that he thought did a good job. And the acquisition system was was a big part of that, right? There were a number of laws passed. There was the Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act, which I think was passed in maybe 94. Don't quote me on that exactly. There was the Clinger-Cohen Act, right? Named after two senators, right? That had a number of significant reforms around IT and acquisition passed in like maybe 95 or 6, somewhere in there. And then there were a whole series. There was a Harvard professor who was ran the Office of Federal Procurement Policy named Steve Kellman, who had a whole bunch of ideas around doing things in a more commercial way in the federal government, right? There was a big push for COTS and dual use because the Cold War was over. So, you know, there's a good history lesson there, certainly more thorough than I've given. But the point is, the system does go through periods like this, right, where there's pretty dramatic change. And one thing I hope we talk about today, I'm certainly going to talk about some of the initial questions that the COI team has for me is around implementation, right? And you know, big systems like this need time to digest change, and then you have to kind of watch how it ripples through. And I think if you're sitting, you know, if you're Scott or somebody, you're sitting on the FAR overhaul team, it's kind of an inside the beltway exercise, right? Where you're writing new policy and coming up with new ideas and putting those things out. It's like, how does something like the acquisition system take those up? And how does somebody who's a GS-13 at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base with a warrant actually take the new ideas that you have written into policy and put them into practice, right? And that, to me, is the most fascinating thing that we'll be able to watch here, right, over the next couple of years. So with that, I'll stop blabbing, at least for now, and we could get into some Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alan. So starting with the FAR overhaul, and you know, just kind of digging into that topic first. During your time as the FAS commissioner, what were some of the significant challenges that you saw in the existing FAR framework, and how did they impact federal acquisition processes?
Yeah, I think, you know, it just was a fundamentally different time than it is now, right? I mean, we did not have in the Trump 1 or Trump 45, as some are calling it, right, did not, you know, it was a kind of first time through, right, for the president and the team on the transition. And I don't think we had as much of an overarching strategy in terms of how we wanted to change or reshape the acquisition system. That said, there were some things that, you know, we did focus on and get done primarily through some initiatives that we ran out of GSA, right, you know, under Emily Murphy's direction, and also some things that we got done from a legislative perspective, right? So if you think about things like unpriced schedules, for example, right, and driving, you know, kind of relieving some burden from industry, right, and you know, doing pricing at the task order level, which is really where, you know, which really things happen, which I think was like Section 876 or something in an NDA. If you think about the use of commercial solutions openings authority, right, for solicitations, right, that sort of first came out then. There were things like at GSA, we piloted something called the informed debriefing process. The idea being there to, as a way to potentially cut down on protests and also provide really much better, kind of deeper, richer feedback to industry, increase a dialogue between government and industry around bids that weren't successful, so that industry could ultimately be more successful the next time they got up to bat, right? And there were some, you know, there were some sort of externally driven things around supply chain security, right? Like the Section 889 provision around, you know, telecom and that sort of thing. GSA got involved in the SBIR program in a big way for Phase 3 awards. So there were, you know, there were a number of, I would call them sort of pain points or areas where we thought we could make real improvement at the margins in the system, but they were done kind of in a one-off way, right? They weren't necessarily done like this current change is being done, where there's a sort of this overarching framework and then you're very systematically working your way through the entire system. So I think we did good things and there was real benefit from those things. Just the mandate was different, and the you know, I would say the alignment between executives, right, in the secretaries and political appointees who ran departments and the White House, I think, was different last time than it is this time. And it's enabling this team to do something at greater scale and faster.
Thank you for that. Any potential challenges that you see with the ongoing FAR overhaul?
So I mean, I alluded to it a little bit in my little preamble there, but I think, to me, it's all about implementation, right? This is the same thing I said when there's this flurry of executive orders that came out. Everyone's, oh my gosh, right? It's like, holy cow. It's like, hey, yes. And writing the 4-page executive order that says you're going to consolidate procurement for all common goods and services at GSA is not the hard part, actually. The hard part then is actually going and doing it, right? And implementing it. And so, I think the SPAR team, and I certainly have talked to, some leaders on the inside there at GSA who are helping drive this. I do think they have an eye on implementation, but I think you've really got to be creative around that, right? You've got to think about, I think you have to have sort of a change strategy. And I know consultants are out of favor these days, right? And nobody wants to hire a consultant. Okay, fine, right? But, consultants, if they were running a big project like this, they would have a change strategy, right? And they would talk about how you communicate the change, who influencers in an organization are, who early adopters are. Do you do things like, do you go look at the performance management system, for example, right, in an organization? And do you say, I need to change some of the factors and how we measure people's performance in order to get them to adopt some of these new things that we want to do? If you're a leader in the organization, you might say, how do I create the right environment, right? I've heard the FAR team say, and they want to put more discretion in people's hands, right? They're going to strip the FAR down, only statutory requirements. They're going to put a bunch of things in buying guides. Okay, that sounds like a fine idea. You're going to put more discretion in the hands of contracting officers in the field. That's great. Somebody out in the field, right? Again, that GS-13, that GS-14, they've got to be comfortable that they have air cover from leadership to go use this discretion, right? Because if I have more discretion and I try something that's maybe a little bit new or a little bit different and it doesn't work out, is somebody going to say, hey, that was a good try, let's learn a couple lessons from that and be better the next time? Or are they going to say, you're fired? And if they say you're fired, then you know what people, what that GS-13 in the field says? I'm not doing anything new, right? I'm going to hunker down here, right? I'm going to do the tried and true. And I'll let somebody else be first mover, right? But it isn't going to be me. So I think there's a lot leaders can do in terms of communicating that it's okay to do that. But then I think something like the federal government, you got to institutionalize it. You got to, again, put it in the performance management system, right? You really have to think about how you create the conditions that outlast any individual leader and help you drive that change that you're spending a lot of time. And I'm supportive. I think, many of the ideas are excellent ideas, right? It's like, okay, let's just make sure that they actually get ingested by the system and that we see the results, right? You get the results from the policy changes you're making.
Great point. That topic's bubbled up so much during the AI acquisition event that was a few weeks ago. It seemed like that was the consistent feedback from federal agencies, is that they need that top cover in order to implement any of these changes. And then moving on to commercialization. In April, the president issued the Executive Order 14271, reminding all that's the ensuring commercial cost-effective solutions in federal contracts. What's your assessment on how well federal government utilizes commercial solutions?
Yeah, so I think it's kind of a case-by-case basis, right? I chuckled a little bit when I read the executive order because it references I think it references FASA or something. It references like a 1994 law, right? So, my initial reaction to that would be, hey, if you're writing an executive order in 2025 about something that was a law passed in 1994, right? Why are you writing an executive order, right, about something that's a law that's been on the books for 31 years, right? And so you may want to go back and ask yourself, if you don't think you're getting the result from the law, why is that, right? What are the stumbling blocks? I think, look, many of the business processes that are automated in the federal government have been around a long time, and the solutions that automated them are old. And you go to somewhere like an IRS or something like that. And so what you've had kind of over time is you can't really get rid of the old solutions. You just get like commercial tech kind of layered on top of the old solutions. So then, it's a question of like, do you have the time and the money if you really wanted to get off of the old solutions, right, that's that requires time and money, which I just don't think, given how things are budgeted and, given kind of some of the missions of the agency and so how appropriators feel about these things, the government hasn't necessarily had the time and space and resources to do that. So I think you've also got to sort of just look at this on a case-by-case basis, right? There are examples of where people have taken, COTS packages. I mean, if you look, say, at the sort of like the financial processes within a government, right? There are a number of COTS packages that are in use there. Now, you might look at those and say, yes, but then the government has laid on a number of additional requirements, right? Where they've customized those packages, and you say, okay, well, is that better or worse than just building it from scratch? I think it depends on the amount of customization you do, kind of the cost of those things. But every idea where you customize a COTS package is in and of itself usually a good idea, right? There's like a real requirement behind it, a business need for it, right? Something that somebody had. So it's I think to be successful, if you really want to get out of this, build custom and go COTS, you got to sort of attack the process first, right? And say, you know what, we're going to change our processes and align our processes with how the software works. And then, then we can go buy commercial solutions. If you don't really change those processes, then you are going to buy something commercial, but you're going to end up, customizing it, or you're going to have to keep your old custom code running, and you're going to lay something commercial on top of it. So, that's a sort of spaghetti at the wall kind of answer. But I think I would say the government's been has had mixed success in buying and deploying COTS packages, right? Which is probably why the EO was written. I'm just not sure it gets at the root cause of what has inhibited the government up to this point. So we'll see how it rolls out in execution.
And I think what you're talking about there, Alan, too, is really important with like the process and the root cause. Like from an agile perspective, I'm always asking teams why. Why are you doing something? And everyone thinks they're special. And you look at the government, and they're no exception, where we're like, well, our budget process is special because of the way we do the budget with Congress. And, we're spending taxpayer dollars. We got to do it wisely. And the Treasury is a special animal. But, there's all these like Fortune 500 companies out there that are able to, build budgets and track finances. And they do it very well. They're not losing millions and millions of dollars every year because of that. So if they're doing it, well, why can't we like incorporate those best practices into like our approaches? And so I think this kind of goes to like the whole like one gov kind of strategy. And I'd love to know what you kind of see as the outcomes of that one gov strategy, like as we're moving through this transformation.
Yeah, so the one gov strategy, it's interesting, right? I think the core of it, well, I think it's first and foremost about trying to get the government to buy. And I've heard Josh Grunbaum, who's the current FAS commissioner, say, hey, try and get the government to buy with a single federal wallet, right? For certain goods and services, for what are being called common goods and services. I think it's really about taking more of what I would consider kind of a corporate approach to procurement, right? Where you say, it's interesting, right? You talk to some people. I have a colleague I served with in the Trump administration. He was the CIO of a department. He thinks about that department as the enterprise, right? And I said, this team doesn't think about your department as the enterprise. They think about your department as one department among many in an enterprise, right? And the enterprise is the government. So it is, I think, really trying to change the lens through which people think about how to run, operate things, how to buy things in this case, right? To thinking about the government as an enterprise for certain things. It seems like, right, one area that they've been very deliberate and focused a lot on is around trying to negotiate what I would call kind of enterprise type agreements with big software OEMs, right? And trying to get those vendors, we're talking about companies like Salesforce and Adobe and ServiceNow, right? Trying to get them to have a direct relationship through the government. So the government has privity of contract with getting those vendors directly on GSA schedule, and really kind of changing the model by which those vendors, if you will, go to market, how they work with integrators and potentially how they work with value-added resellers. So that, I think, to date has been the most tangible component of that OneGov strategy. I think you could lump the creation of the Office of Centralized Acquisition Services, or OCAS, at GSA, right, where they are going to try and ingest and do the buying for those common goods and services across government. I think that's sort of also part of the OneGov strategy. So in my mind, those are the two most those are kind of the two most visible, tangible components of that strategy. You could potentially lump other things in there as well, but I think for now, that's a lot, right? If you were to kind of just get those two things done, those are two pretty big, significant things. And I think, if I was GSA, I would take a breath, right, and focus on execution for a little while and make sure I got those things right, and went into 26 feeling pretty good about how I'm doing in those two areas.
Yeah. It's so true what you say about like the enterprises and one department thinking they're an enterprise and not, seeing themselves as part of the broader enterprise. You see it even at different agencies within like, DHS, for instance, where, you've got some components that think they're the enterprise. And you say, no, you're part of the one DHS. And then you roll up and it's like, no, that one DHS is part of OneGov. And there's a whole lot of kind of like territorial disputes there, as well as some cultural change and some snowflakes, right? That say, no, like, I'm special. Like what we do here is really unique from what we do at what you all do over at education or HUD or wherever it is.
Yeah.
How do you overcome that?
Yeah, it's funny, actually. I have a decent example just from GSA. When I was there, ran the acquisition service, right? There are a series of portfolios. At that time, there were sort of kind of 5 big portfolios in the acquisition service. And they each sort of thought of themselves as an enterprise, right? And so, one thing there is we created for executives, right? We significantly shortened the performance plans and had a very few metrics, many of which were shared metrics, right? So if you're an executive, maybe you would have 5 metrics we're going to measure how you do for the year, and 3 of those metrics were shared across the enterprise, and 2 of them were specific to your portfolio, right? So that got people.
We're all in this boat
Yes.
together. We're either going to sink or swim as one.
That's correct, right? It doesn't, there's a little bit of play in there, right? So there's some things that are specific to your portfolio. Great, we're going to measure you on this, but there are some things that we're going to look at across. In that case, right, we're taking the acquisition services, the enterprise, across the enterprise, and get measured on those, right? So that gets people. I definitely believe smart people respond to incentives, right? And there are a bunch of smart people in government, right? So you create the right set of incentives and you measure them appropriately, you should get some of the behavior that you want. Now you have to watch that, because sometimes you can, create some incentives that have, that maybe have some unintended consequences. But I think that is one way that you can corral that. I mean, the other way is, just a very sort of top down, kind of, hey, the secretary decrees that this is it. And, the old joke, right, about occasionally got to make an example of somebody, right? If somebody steps out of line, they have to get pounded, right? And then everyone else says, oh, it's a bad idea to step out of line. I don't want to get pounded, right? Now that's that's kind of an old school, style of management. Obviously, I think everyone much prefers hey, let's create a system with the right incentives that gets people to react the right way. You can then carry a little bit of a big stick, which if someone does step out of line, right, you can make an example of them. But gosh, it's much better if you think about creating a system that drives the right kind of behavior that you want, which is, again, focus on shared metrics, shared goals, should get people working together and thinking about how they can support those initiatives that are bigger and broader than just their own narrow purview.
Well, to bring this back away from violence, let's talk about something that is no violence at all: value-added resellers and system integrators. No violence there, I don't think. We got a question from Amy about how you see, you mentioned that like there's this big push to get OEMs to negotiate directly with government to get them onto GSA schedules. And so you've got, system integrators and value-added resellers. How do you see that dynamic changing as the government starts to negotiate more with like those OEMs?
Yeah, that's going to be really fascinating. I mean, I think SIs and VARs are, literally trying to figure that out in real time. I mean, one answer to that could be, look, if the government's going to be direct to a big software provider, then if they need help, say implementing the software, or if there are some things a VAR does that an OEM finds valuable, they could simply subcontract with those, right? They could subcontract with the SI, they could subcontract with the VAR, right? I mean, just you sort of flip the relationship, create a little bit of a different looking team. It's going to take a little bit of time. If that's how people end up going to market, it's going to take a little bit of time to work out, right? Because that's not how the market is organized today, right? And I think, particularly when you think about how SIs go to market with some of those solutions, right? They go as the lead, bringing the solution in to help the customer solve a problem, right? So this sort of changes that, right? Sometimes like the software might already be there, and then the SI can kind of get brought in on the back end. So it's a different way of going to market, and I think, we'll have to sort of see, right, how that sorts itself out. I don't think the big software companies, the big software providers really have an appetite for growing a very large services presence, right? I mean, most of them have, professional services arms. They tend to be, by design, very expensive. They're kind of often brought in for short periods of time to help solve problems or unstick things. But it's just, those businesses, like the way those businesses report to Wall Street, the margins they have, the kind of people they recruit, the way they manage their talent, it's different than a large system integrator, right? Which is a services business with different margins, lots more people, different kind of talent pipeline, right? Like, so it's, and I don't see, some of those large kind of Fortune 500 technology companies really creating like a massive services arm on there. I think they will continue to partner with SIs as they go to market. I think for the SIs, the question becomes, if things get unbundled a little bit, this administration in particular seems keen on questioning the value of system integrators, right? And I've heard some officials, say things like, hey, it's not that we don't see value in SIs. We don't think that it's priced appropriately, right? We don't think that, that will be, but ultimately that's for a customer to decide, right? Are they getting a good deal? Are their requirements being met? Are they getting the services that they need? But if the government really is successful, they do negotiate these direct agreements with the software OEMs. It is going to change how SIs go to market. And VARs, definitely could potentially upend that market too. I do think there are a number of things that VARs do. They do a little bit of the dirty work for the OEMs, right? That they don't really want to do. And so I think there'll probably still be, that there's a need there. One thing I think that might be a little bit different is, it's not clear to me if GSA goes and negotiates, say, an agreement for, hundreds of or millions of tokens or hundreds of thousands of licenses, right? VARs oftentimes would handle a lot of the ordering. There might be hundreds of orders that come in for a big OEM over the course of the year, all kinds of paperwork and back and forth and pricing drills. And again, stuff that OEMs are like, I don't want to, I hire engineers, I hire salespeople, right? That's my model, right? All that admin stuff, that's why I have a VAR. If GSA can cut down on some of that administrative work, right, by essentially creating, many fewer orders, then you might sort of question, well, like, okay, what is the role of the VAR here? Or does it have to change somewhat? There's a lot of unanswered questions. I think, first of all, the government's got to get these agreements executed, right, and get people directly on schedule. And then, then let's see how people go to market. One great thing is there are a lot of smart people in this space, and they'll generally figure out something that works for customers and create a usable business model, even if it all gets upended. Yep.
Well, that's a great seg into the next question about technology. Because what you were talking about is, managing orders, managing spend, looking at all that. You mentioned in your intro, you helped to lead the Technology Modernization Fund in your career. So where do you see technology helping with federal procurement or with these agencies as they move into this kind of one gov strategy?
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of talk about AI right now. Obviously, the president just released an AI action plan. I mean, it's, every business, every technology business feels like it's an AI business now. Okay, I've been around long enough. I gave my little mid-90s, acquisition reform view, right? Hey, I worked for a business-to-business e-commerce company. I had the 4th largest IPO in the history of the NASDAQ, December 10th, 1999. I mean, I went through that, 1.0 cycle on the internet also. And sometimes, these things, like, there are big changes. We kind of get the hype cycle. You sort of get a little bit ahead of yourself, right? And then the implementation lags, and you do see the change, but it's, it takes a while. I joke with my kids. I say, so we have dogs, right? So we order from Chewy, which is it's like, right, they deliver, pet stuff online, right? It's like, that's a real business, right? So, my kids are like, yeah, it's a real business. I'm like, yeah, there was this thing called pets.com 25 years ago, right? That was, the same business. It just was a little bit ahead of its time. It bombed, right? So we may be just a hair ahead of ourselves, right, in terms of how we think AI is really going to change things. I remember when I was at GSA, we did some work with RPA, right, robotic process automation, and we were trying to use RPA to get rid of some of the kind of drudgery type work around acquisition, right, creating some of these form letters and things like that. It was kind of a forerunner, right, to AI. And to me, the big question is, and this is not my idea. There's a guy I follow called Benedict Evans, who's an technology analyst, a super sharp guy. If you haven't, you should follow him. He writes a free newsletter, and he's super. He talks about AI. He says, the big question around AI is does it really just turn into software that automates some series of business processes, or is it something bigger, right? Where you really do create like something that can think, that has true human-like intelligence, and that can like orchestrate a team of agents to actually go and execute a complex series of business processes. Like that, to me, that I don't know the answer to that. I think we're early in the game. We don't know, but it's kind of like, hey, is it a spreadsheet, right? Is it, you were an accountant, used to do things by hand. All of a sudden, somebody came along with VisiCalc, and you were like, wow, I can change one thing here, and it populates all this change. Like that used to take me a whole day to do that, right? You tell me I can do it in 5 minutes, that's amazing, right? Is it that? Or is it like electricity, right? Where you're like, oh, wow, I could think potentially of 1,000 things I could do now that the world is electrified, right? And like create whole new industries and like completely changes life, right? Like there's nightlife in a city and we don't have to create, light fires or, put gas around, right? It's like, I don't know the answer to that, right? But to me, that's kind of the fundamental question. So then get all the way back down to like the acquisition system. Is this something that just makes a contracting officer's life a lot easier, where they just, get to spend a lot more time thinking about strategic things, focusing on where the market's going, thinking about things like creating baselines and how to measure savings, for example, in an agreement? Or does it like, we don't need, maybe we need like one person in the contracting shop who's just a, sort of a quick decision maker, but there's literally a team of, hundreds of agents that are out being orchestrated by other even more intelligent agents, right? That are generating all this work and activity. I'm not sure, right? I'm not qualified to answer that question, but I do think it's early. And it will be really fascinating to see how it plays out.
Yeah, it's
How's
one of
that
those.
for an answer?
Oh my goodness, great. You answered my next question even as you were answering my first question. But I think it's a really exciting time as well, and that we're just gonna have to wait and see where it goes. But I know that one thing that we're gonna need as we transition into that is probably Ben's next question. That's gonna talk more about the policy.
Yeah. So thanks, Alan, and thanks, Scott. As we look forward, I mean, you just sort of picking up from your last comment, Alan. Where do you see some of this playing out, maybe looking a little bit further ahead? So over the next 4 to 5 years, once we get past some of the initial crush of some of the changes that are happening, where would you envision this is in 24, 36, 48 months? And what that's going to look like in areas that will need sort of continuous focus and improvement over time?
Yeah, I'm always, I'm looking for use cases. And actually, when I was thinking about this, we did a couple prep sessions for this. I was thinking actually it would be a good role for ACT-IAC to collect up AI use cases, right? For where, particularly around acquisition, right? Maybe this community of interest could do that, right? Because there was a press release from GSA yesterday, kind of a breathless press release. GSA propels federal government into future with AI, right? And you say, okay, that's great. It's like, man, I looked at that release. I said, okay, great, good work, wholly supportive. Boy, it would have been really compelling if in the release there had been one or two example use cases, right, of where someone was using AI specifically to deliver a clear benefit, right? I didn't see it. And my sense is that it's because we don't have that many of them yet, right? And so again, the kind of technology is like outpacing the our ability not to think necessarily of how to apply it, but to actually apply it and show the benefit from them. So some things I would be looking for are in like maybe 3 years, 4 years. I think it's be kind of interesting to watch the people in this space, right? Does a contracting officer, does a contract specialist, does somebody on a program team working on a big acquisition, what does their day-to-day look like, right? Are they, kind of using similar tools to what they're using today? Are they performing kind of similar functions, right? Is that, again, is it a little bit better? Like, hey, I've got a spreadsheet now instead of, writing this stuff down manually. Like my life's better. I save some time, but it's not fundamentally different, right? Or has it been really transformed in some way? And there maybe are whole chunks of my job that I just sort of give over to an agent, right? That I'm kind of in charge of. I think also it'd be good to see what kind of people are being attracted into this career path in a few years, right? So for example, do you get people who maybe have done this in the private sector, right? Who have some of those kind of skills, who are interested in coming into government? Do you get people maybe who are a little more who are tech savvy, right? Who think about I think about kids today, like people graduating from college, right? Who do, they're working with data and things like that. I mean, they're doing a little programming, right? They're working in Python and R and stuff like that, right? They're not spreadsheet jockeys, really, right? I mean, they obviously know how to work in a spreadsheet, no problem. But there's like another kind of level of skill that they're bringing that's a little more technology focused. Does that happen in the acquisition career, right? Do people feel like I need to be really good at kind of, thinking about AI and how I use agents and that sort of thing, to actually, get the kind of result that I want? So that, I guess I'd be looking kind of at those things, like, what's a day in the life of a CO or a CS? And then what's the pipeline of people look like? Are they coming in with different kinds of skills, or are they kind of similar, right? Could we look at that pipeline and say, yep, that's the profile of somebody we recruited 10 years ago, right? Because if it is, it tells me it's not changing that much, right? Again, maybe changing a little bit, but there haven't been a radical change.
Yeah, I mean, and you raise an interesting point of like, is the accomplishment just getting AI tool sets on schedule versus leveraging AI solutions for mission-oriented use cases to have impact in terms of what those agencies are trying to do, and think about it as a means to an end, if you will.
Yes. Yeah. No, that's super well stated, Ben. Yeah. Yeah. The point. Yeah. Look, any acquisition person, right? They should ultimately care about the end mission, right? The point isn't just to, sort of say, hey, we did an acquisition. It's like, hey, we do an acquisition to achieve some result, right, that a customer of ours has, right? And that's what we care about, right? So same thing here, right? We make these tools available because people need them in order to achieve some result that's better than what they were able to do previously. So we'll see. I mean, look, I'm this administration has moved fast in a number of areas. I think that's awesome. Some of these changes take time to move through the system, right? And in some sense, it's like an unfair bar because you move so quickly to make the change, right? And you write it down in the policy, you write the executive order, and then you're like, all right, well, tune in next month and let's see how it goes. It's like, hey, that's not how it works, right? Like you to your point, you got to look a couple years down the line, be a little bit patient. these things usually get adopted, right? Take the pets.com example, like great idea. You guys were just, you were 15, 20 years too early, right? But you were onto something good there.
All right. So shifting gears a little bit, you have a lot of experience, both government and industry. I've worked in small businesses. A lot of the audience is likely on the industry side today, looking at sort of how this is impacting them. What advice would you give to small businesses that are in this space to maybe better navigate this procurement landscape and effectively compete for contracts in the government space?
Yeah, I think there are a number of things that this administration is emphasizing. I think the system is changing in some ways that might make it more challenging for small businesses, because if you're buying with a single federal wallet, that's obviously can be a lot about scale, and that can be challenging for small businesses to compete on scale. But I do think there's also been some emphasis on what I would call sort of these different acquisition pathways, different procurement pathways. So things like other transactions, solicitation techniques like CSOs, you mentioned at the very beginning, the SBIR program, right? A huge emphasis on that, and Trump 45, and I think you'll see that again in the current administration. Those are things that can be very friendly to small businesses. They can be very friendly, particularly to new entrants who are small and want to get in this market. And want to, potentially challenge some of the established players. So I do think there are avenues where small businesses can succeed. I mean, look, smalls always tend to be a little bit more nimble. Oftentimes, they're closer. They can be a little bit closer to the customer. Certainly have like top leadership in the company closer to the customer than sometimes at bigs. Not always, right? But sometimes. So I think on some of those things, if you're small, you need to, like on the procurement pathways I mentioned, you need to actually really understand. You need to have your delivery teams really understand what those things are and be able to educate your government customer. Because my sense is still on some of those things, government customers are, if they haven't done it before, right, they'll be a little hesitant, right? And I think industry and small business can definitely do this, right? Play a role in helping educate some government folks about using some of those different pathways, right? And when they might be appropriate, and pointing them to examples, and right, kind of creating a little bit of a network effect there. So if I was a small business, I would think about, I would look at those pathways and think about how I can best leverage them to help my business be successful. I would also say I do think it's always fun to be the prime. I get it. I've been on the industry side. Life's better as the prime. I understand. But if you're small, sometimes there can be really good subcontracting opportunities, right? And to the extent that the government continues to put good, aggressive small business goals in prime contracts, I think like on the Alliant 2 GWAC, I feel like it might have been, I don't know if it's 50% or something like that, right? It's a big number, right? There can be really good opportunities where small businesses can be a sub on a much larger deal where they just couldn't have the scale to compete as a prime, and you can do quite well, right? So I think there are opportunities. I think there are opportunities out there. Oh, there we go. So I knew this crowd. Somebody would know the answer to that question. Yes. Excellent. Thank you, Jillian.
All right. So shifting over. Talking about collaboration between government and industry and, engaging with your stakeholders, what do you think are some effective strategies that industry folks can employ these days, especially with what we're seeing in the current environment to, connect with customers and potential customers? It's a little bit different ballgame today than maybe it was 12 or 24 months ago. And so what have you seen that has worked, and what would you recommend for this audience?
Yeah, so it is a different ball game, and it's changed in a few ways. One, I think, interesting way is as more people have returned to the office, right, with return to office mandates, I do think industry feels like from an ability to get a hold of somebody and actually maybe get in front of them, that's been helpful. right? That kind of particularly getting, senior people kind of back in the office on a more regular basis, I think, has been good. I mean, GSA, I think, does a pretty good job of this. Some other agencies, kind of mixed. It can kind of depend on the person you get. I do feel like the government could always do a little bit better job of just being more open throughout the process, right? It's the easy button in the government to say, oh, we're thinking about a procurement, I can't talk to you. The truth is, right, I don't need to lock down communications until the RFP is out the door, right? I mean, there's an RFI on the street or that, right? Or, we're doing market research. Like, that's a perfect time to be talking to industry, right? And there's nothing that says you have to, talk to every single participant during that phase, right? I mean, I think being open there would be helpful. I always encourage industry people, like, hey, you got to show up, right? You got to offer ideas, right? I mean, you got to be a little bit relentless in terms of that, right? Always a little bit pushing there, right? To want to meet, to want to talk. And then, even more important than that is, I always say, like, hey, the most important thing is not the meeting. Washington is a town full of people that can get you a first meeting. It's like, what do you say, right? You have to actually have something of interest to say to the government. And, you have to be, I think industry has to do, you have to kind of put yourself in the government's shoes, right? And really, you're obviously selling your solution, right? Or your vision, right? But you have to think about, how does it benefit the government, right? If it's sort of walk in and it's all about, your company and your solution and why it's great for you and you'll conquer the world, that from a government perspective, that's not that interesting, right? Like, I need to know, kind of how is what you're doing, what's good for you, how does it connect and help me achieve whatever I'm trying to achieve in my program, right? So really creating that link. This is like basic stuff that you would be shocked at how many people don't do this. So I can remember when I was at GSA, I would do Fridays, right? I would kind of hold a chunk of time every Friday to meet with industry, right? And I mean, look, some of the meetings are great. People would come in, they'd want to talk about some specific issue, they'd have an idea, right? They'd be, super focused, and they'd say, hey, this is, how it's going to benefit the government, right? And then other times people would come in and they would do like a standard CAPES brief, or they would, just, right? It was like, you can tell the people who are like, hey, you got to be on point, right? You got to put yourself in the audience's shoes, right? And think about how to kind of use their time appropriately. So again, like when you get the meeting, have something to say that really addresses what the audience wants to hear, what the audience needs to hear.
Do your homework so you're coming in prepared and you can apply it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. There's a high bar, I would say now. I feel like there's like what I would consider a higher bar for homework, right? Like you have, you have Claude and you have OpenAI, right? And you have, like there's a lot of things you can do to gather a lot of information and synthesize a lot of information fairly quickly. So there's not a ton of excuse for not doing homework. Same on the government's part, right? There's actually a lot of things from a market research standpoint they can do and gather that could potentially help them kind of narrow in or focus in on maybe some people that they really do want to talk to.
Mike?
So I want to pivot and kind of expand upon something that you were talking about earlier, and you can go off of a little bit of the pets.com example that you kind of played off. So there's a lot going on in terms of regulatory and compliance and even statutory changes that are being brought up around the acquisition framework. But broader than that, there's an even bigger regulatory compliance and statutory framework that's being adjusted to allow for markets to better interact. And the pets.com example, they were early to market. Maybe UPS and FedEx wasn't able to facilitate. There weren't the shipping options and the logistics options they had to be able to facilitate that. The e-commerce platforms weren't there to facilitate what they were doing. Where is it possible to break down some of these regulatory and compliance boundaries to enable some of the innovative tech solutions that might be able to actually break out and really cause meaningful change in how the government does business? And is there anything outside of the acquisition framework, both relative to the federal government and not, that you can think of to expand upon?
Yeah, Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I guess I would say there's got to be kind of a spirit. You got to have sort of like a spirit of experimentation with some of these things and that's particularly challenging in a big, if you take the government as the enterprise or even a single department as the enterprise, that can be kind of challenging in those sorts of organizations, right? You aren't often rewarded for, taking risks or, so I worked in this activity. This was an Intel activity in DoD, it was an R&D activity. And the guy who ran the activity had a great line. He would say, like, hey, we need to be drilling some dry holes, right? If you're looking for oil, right? If you're looking for oil, you need to drill some dry holes, right? I don't want you to come back and tell me you drilled 10 dry holes, right? But if you tell me all I did was drill 2 holes and I hit oil both times, I said, you're not drilling enough, right? That you need to be, so he had like a spirit of experimentation. Tell me you were 5 out of 10, right? Like, that's awesome. Found oil 5 times and you're kind of pushing boundaries. So I think you need, it's a little bit of, everyone says, oh, culture, right? But I think culture just is, again, a reflection of like incentives and things you can do institutionally to get people to want to experiment more with things. And then I do think you have to have a little bit of patience on those things, because that goofy pets.com example, right, is just like, it took time, right? And it wasn't anything, the business model actually was pretty good. It's pretty similar. It just was, if you look at the graph, right, of how much people shop online, it's this steady march upward, right, from 2000 on. It's just, they were just early, right? That's just not how we bought stuff back then, right? Very few of us did, right? You can't make a business selling pet food to early adopters, right? But at some point, enough people bought enough things online that you were like, oh, that business makes complete sense, actually, right? And it's going to take off. So you have to be, kind of patient. Maybe have some, from the government's perspective, maybe you're like patient with your investments. I mean, I know the government's getting more into investing things, right? With the DoD's doing some things there.
Right, the Sovereign Wealth Fund comes to mind, and then
Sure.
Office of Strategic Capital at Department of
Correct.
Defense, trying to drive
Correct.
some of these markets and like lower barriers. For example, AI takes tremendous amounts of energy, and leveraging a national energy grid versus regional energy grids, and how do you make sure to be able to facilitate that?
That's right. And I think then, the question comes in sort of like, oh, what role does the government play in that? Or do you just, do they just do things to kind of encourage the private sector? And, we could probably have an interesting sort of debate about that. I do think in one area, the administration has done something really good with the AI action plan in that, and I'm not trying to necessarily beat up on the last team, right? But I do think they were, if you look at the AI executive order of the Biden administration, right, it was a lot about sort of what could go wrong, right? It was sort of like doing a lot of things to plan for what could go wrong. And I do think this team has done a good job of sort of, taking some of that away and focusing more on the possibilities, right? Now, again, let's see, because something's going to go wrong, right? More than one thing's going to go wrong. It's like, okay, how are we going to react to that? Is that going to be okay? And hey, we'll fix it and move on, right? Or does it become sort of a big scandal? But I do really like that they've, that is, to me, is like a culture change that they've created, right? With that plan, where it feels like people are be much more willing to experiment, and we're saying, oh, this is too important to not kind of push the boundaries on, right? So from that standpoint, I think, I think that's good, right? And that, that's a national level plan, right? It talks about a number of things, reducing regulation, for example. It talks about energy in there, things like that, making it easier to build data centers. That can sort of percolate down in the system. So to me, there are some good examples in there of that kind of big systemic change that you're talking about, Michael, that then drives some benefit.
Yeah, it's both a macro culture and then gets into taking that culture and making it tactical for the acquisition exercises that everybody goes through on an individual procurement basis, right? Moving
That's
from
right.
Luddite laggard to early adopters and pushing the needle there.
Yes.
with that kind of like, I want to wrap up kind of talking around culture and impact to the workforce, and some of your advice that you might give to people who are looking to kind of get into the acquisition career, both on the contractor side and on the government side. How do you kind of see the so you talked earlier about the AI systems, and how is it going to be a change that is the average contracting officer today taking advantage of AI in a meaningful way to help them remove tasks and be able to spread themselves over a broader number of efforts? Or is this really a truly an agentic change that's going to move the needle and then perhaps potentially reduce the dependency on human beings within that area? And so can you kind of talk a little bit about what's the right balance between that, and then how does that also help provide acquisition professionals with the procurement data that they need to be able to make the smart decisions on behalf of the taxpayer? And where does the kind of human being sit within that loop there?
Yeah. I don't know what the right balance is, right? I mean, again, I think we're early days on this, and we're all going to kind of go through learning together on that. Look, I still think humans are going to be important, right? I'm certainly not one of those people who says, "Oh, it's just we're all just going to be on the beach in 10 years, right?" And the systems are just going to be kind of running themselves. Yeah, Scott's got his fingers crossed there. Yeah. Wear your sunscreen, Scott. So I think people will be important, right? I don't know, right? I'm not starting to figure out kind of what that balance is going to be like, but I did, in answering Ben's question, like there are some markers for me, right, around like, okay, how much has this really changed things? Are we just making kind of existing things much more efficient, or again, is it spreadsheets or is it electricity? Like, I'm not sure. I do think the data will be, you mentioned data. I do think data will be very important. I do think there's will always be a role for a human in sort of interpreting that data, right? And that there's AI machine, right, can gather a lot of things, synthesize it, right, bring it together. But I do think there are certain decisions that have to be made, and for a long time, I feel like we're going to continue to want humans in the loop on those decisions, right? I mean, I think about something that's a little more life and death than acquisition, which is something like medical care. It's like, hey, I think it's great, right, if there are systems that can go out and gather and synthesize tons of information that an individual doctor could not, right? But once that information gets gathered and synthesized, I then probably want a doctor who I have a relationship with to help me think through what the right decisions are to make based on that data, right? And that in the acquisition space, I think there's always going to probably be a human involved in an award decision, right? Again, even with all the data, there may be recommendations made, right? But ultimately, I think there'll still be a human in that in that loop. I think, to me, the one thing that, like, if you're thinking about getting into this career field, or you're already in it or whatever, it's like, hey, I would always just want to get connected with some kind of mission. Or do you believe in the mission? Do you believe in the outcome you're trying to achieve? And then you can go, maybe you're an acquisition person, maybe you're a finance person, maybe you actually you're on the program team that's, actually trying to deliver on it, right? But like identify with some sort of mission or mission set that you really care about. Not, then you, whatever you're doing can feel meaningful. And even if your role changes significantly in that, right? And the technology, what I started doing today and I get 10 or 15 years of my career, it's markedly different than what I was doing. But if I still identify with the mission and like the outcome I'm driving, then I'm probably still going to be satisfied with that work, right? So that would be my advice or guidance there from a career standpoint.
It's like the old adage that the janitor's job at NASA was to put a man on the moon, right? And that's the answer that he would give.
That's correct. That's right.
It takes a whole village to get things done. Alan, I want to really thank you for being here today. This has been a great conversation, and I think one that we could talk about for another hour. I really want to thank you on behalf of the Acquisition COI, and Gisa, I'll let you throw in a thanks too.
Oh, thanks from the GSA from the Acquisition COI, as well as the GSA FIA team. Thank you very, very much.
And thanks
Thanks.
to everybody who was here today as well to join us. Please give us a big round of applause to Mr. Alan Thomas, the one and only Mr. Alan
The
Thomas.
one and only Alan Thomas. That's right.
Thanks for having me, everybody. Take care. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks. You
Bye
too.
all.
Bye.